Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak and to, get a context of who all's here, and I realize I stand between you and lunch, so I'll speed it along here, but also appreciate your time and consideration. So, the talk is concerning balancing energy and biodiversity, and obviously an extremely important topic. I hope what I'll be talking about today is relevant. You'll see how it's relevant to that, and this is the topic that has driven my presentation and the origin of our program here. Energy development is a big deal. I mean, it's coming up in the presidential campaign. It's a debate point. It's national security. It's gigantic. And so I think there's no underselling the fact that this is a large issue that we all need to wrestle with, and obviously in the West, in terms of its concern and impacts to fish and wildlife, is extremely important. So what I want to talk about this morning is this Towards a West-Wide Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, or CHAT. And before I do that, or as I do that, I think most importantly, maybe I first want to get into some specifics about what it is that we're doing with this West-Wide Chat. And I want to present to you the big picture of this as the collaborative context to this. I'm speaking to you today as a representative of this effort. I'm not a leader. I'm not, I am one of the collaborators, and I represent the entire group of what are the 17 Western states involved in this. And so I want to first off start by telling you that we need to recognize first the initiative and the leadership of the Western governors back in 2008 that got this ball rolling. The 17 Western states and those fish and wildlife agencies that are collaborating on this, the respective natural heritage programs in all of those states, our other collaborators, NatureServe, USGS, BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a tremendous collaborative effort. As you can imagine, it's just a tiny little piece of land. There's no differences or variation in any of that landscape at all. It's very, everyone knows it's all the same story everywhere you go. So it's a very good collaborative effort. The leadership of the governors got this going. It is the 17 Western states that are working together. And my presentation to you is a representative of that to give you some context of what we're doing and how we're proceeding with this whole thing. So to take that, I'd like to first present you some context of what got this all going. So I want to sort of set the history and first realize that this effort to chat comes from two major things. One was the governors back in 2008 and their recognition and their report on this Wildlife Corridors Initiative that basically recognized first the importance of wildlife corridors and connectivity across the West and maintaining those Western wildlife populations so important, and the economic impact and importance of wildlife in the entire West. And that began the Governor's Corridors Initiative. And then also, similarly, was the idea that in trying to develop renewable energy zones, we looked at data of the states and patched that together to look at large-scale energy development and realized, that doesn't really connect very well when you start to try to do it, particularly among the states. And so there was a recognition that we needed to look at our data and information and try to make that more coherent, and that wildlife, their connectivity, and the importance of wildlife in terms of the economy as well as the values of the West were important, and we needed to do something to balance that with coming energy development. So this came to the fact of that report and the Western governors instituting what is now the Western Governors Wildlife Council, which is a policy-level group that serves at the pleasure of the governors that is driving or supervising this development of this chat. And they are moving ahead the idea that this data and information needs to be put into a format, a geospatial format, in a decision support tool that can operationalize the idea of corridors, connectivity, and wildlife habitats, and the idea of protecting that and providing that information as we move ahead with energy development. So the Western Governors Wildlife Council has moved ahead since that report and taken that forward. And as a result of their actions and a grant through Department of Energy, from the Federal Department of Energy to the Western Governors Association, we initiated across the West these pilot projects to try and look at, okay, we need to develop decision support tools that needs to be based on wildlife data being coherent across these boundaries. And we want to take these 9 different pilots and see how far we can make those progress and move those ahead in terms of development of decision support tools and making this geospatial data speak to energy development. So that was begun about 2009, 2010, and we moved ahead with those pilot projects with the idea being we would move those for 12 months, and then we would come back to the Western Governors Association and then basically in a competitive sense put all the pilot projects against one another to then see which pilot project would then move into a phase 2 approach and make them compete one another with a meritorious kind of approach to say we'll take the best of and move that ahead. However, when all the pilots and all the states sat there and looked at one another, they looked at, and we had the discussion about economies of scale, competitiveness over limited resources, need to standardize the data and information that would answer, if we answered one question, we would be answering all questions. It was basically all the 17 states in the room, and it can very distinctly remember this situation, sat there and said, why do we do a competitive thing? Why don't we just take on the whole thing together? That's the best thing we see in terms of using the resources, using our data and expertise in terms of capacity, and doing it collaboratively to make this actually give us a coherent picture of wildlife across the West. And so this was the thing that moved forward from and was approved by the Wildlife Council from that initial funding of the pilots and the DOE funding, and which now I'm going to talk to you as we've moved into phase 2 and turned this into a West-wide picture of wildlife. So in that context, now I just want to talk maybe a little bit in terms of the technical aspects of what it is that this chat tool and what is going to be the guts, so to speak, of this and how it's going to paint this picture of wildlife. First is the idea of scale, and basically we're looking at this in terms of a 1 square mile hexagon across the entire West. That's the scale of our resolution and the scale at which we will be painting a picture of crucial habitats across the entire West. The bright red is a sort of amalgamation of a 7 square mile hex that we initially threw into the mix thinking we're not quite sure how this is all going to pan out. But since we focused on the 1 square mile hex as one, it's the relative scale of the coarseness of our information that we feel is going to be credible scientifically, that we can forecast at that level. And secondarily, in a hexagon way, we don't run afoul of boundary issues. As you can well imagine, the context of mapping, you always run into what line lines up with what line. A hexagon is not going to run up against any line. Nonetheless, there's a lot of 1 square miles across the entire West, but that's our scale of assessment. Next is within this 1 square mile hex, what we're going to do is use both a coarse and fine filter level of information. So in terms of the coarse filter, we're looking at landscape integrity, large intact blocks, connectivity, and ecosystems of concern. And what you see in the map to the rear is basically the current map of this coarse scale. Looking at the red lines are our measures of connectivity, which we've mapped using a least cost path, pixel by pixel across the West. and then measuring that in terms of that, and that was independent of its connection of large intact blocks. These connectivity areas were mapped independently, then evaluated in terms of their length and centrality and integrity, and then given a relative rank. And so we have those coarse filters across the West. Next, we looked at large intact blocks using the landscape integrity approach, which is basically the human footprint, and looking at those blocks 10,000 acres and larger and their relative integrity. Then we also looked at the species nature serve ecosystems of concern and mapped those in terms of their percent occurrence within a hexagon and their global rank as by nature serve, which is, this is a nationwide data set. And this map here gives you a context. And one of the things we did is we mapped this landscape integrity at a coarse level. We then also truthed it across the West with, this is obviously a computer model, but we went and truthed the data points across the West in all the states to basically gauge on an expert opinion, here's what our landscape and integrity model predicted, go out and look at that site and how did it match. And then we truthed that model up. So that's our coarse filter, landscape integrity, connectivity, large intact blocks, and ecosystems of concern. At a fine filter scale, we're using what you might imagine, which is our empirical species location data or ecological occurrence data, nature serve information. And so that is being mapped for species of greatest conservation need as selected by the states, and for those species of game and sport fish that the states have selected. So we have, as a fine filter, empirical or what we're calling tier 1 data on species location, both in terms of ecological occurrence or specific point data. And then as a second tier level, we're also looking at the gap predicted species occurrence models as a secondary help for that fine filter approach. So then together, we use the coarse filter, landscape integrity, large intact block, connectivity, and ecosystem concern information. Then our fine filter, species of greatest conservation need and species of economic and recreational importance. And looking at the 1 hex scale, basically that, as you can imagine, now we have to roll that information up, hex by hex, across the West. And so we're actually at the point now where we're looking at probably 3 basic ways of doing that. One is an additive sum approach. As you can imagine, we just give a numerical score to each of the layers, depending on what the rank of the species is or the rank of the integrity, and then add that up in a hexagon to get us to a sum, and that gives us to a relative scale of crucialness. Another alternative approach, which I think we're going more towards, is sort of a categorical approach, which is going to look at a relative weighting of those based on what the states know and feel is more important. So there's more of an a priori kind of weighting to each of those, and allow that to get them a categorization for each hexagon, and roll that up together to get them to a way to get all this information together. So then the next step then is that together, as we roll this information up, the intent is to give us 6 basic categories of crucial habitat across the West. And just have here a representation of how that might be fashioned out, looking at that coarse and fine filter approach. And look at our categories, both obviously the A is what we're defining as the most crucial or highest priority, all the way down to an F where there's no or none or less than common within a hexagon. And so basically we're writing the rule set for that roll-up approach, picking the roll-up approach, which will standardize that across the entire West. Important to that, though, is we're then allowing each state to do a relative weighting, and if necessary, depending on their own needs, to add species or give a relative ranking or weighting to species or areas, let's say large intact blocks that they feel are more important. An example might be in Kansas, a large intact block of high integrity of 10,000 acres might be a lot more valuable than that same block in the state of Idaho or Utah. So they might give it a much higher ranking on that, let's say, categorical summation than we would here in Idaho or Utah. So we're allowing the states to make those relative gauges and then to roll that up together to get us to a 6 categorization of crucial habitats across the West. So from here on out, that actually, our first draft of this map is due November 1. That would be tomorrow. These groups are all bringing this state by state together, and then we're going to stitch it together. And then from here on out, this is due in 2013. The chat will be due. So we're working on fine-tuning that product through to the end of 2013, and also the development of the viewer, which is the web-based application by which it will transmit and transfer this information, allow you to access it, drill down through, determine what was in that hex, determine what that crucial habitat was, and what it was all about. So this is obviously a planning level tool. In a sort of hierarchical decision level, as we've all been talking about these last few days. This is not project specific. It's not in a NEPA-based assessment level, the mid-range I would think of this at. It's more at the planning context, which is one area I think we've all been lacking, and for lack of a better term, drawing this big picture that allows an energy company or a conservation approach to know what is important and why, and where is it. And then you can, with full and forthright knowledge, move ahead based on your priorities and your overall risk evaluation. So we see this as a planning tool, and that's a first step, particularly at a West-wide level, that's important and necessary. Secondarily is we're looking in terms of the infrastructure, the data and information. How will it be delivered? How will it be updated? How will it be protected? You know, will it reside in the cloud? Where is it going to actually reside? How will it be queried to maybe, this is some of the important the cyber infrastructure context of this, and how it lives on is part of what the Wildlife Council is working on right now. And secondarily is what is the network and partnership that the Wildlife Council needs to look at to then maintain this, because although the states have most of this wildlife information, they don't have it all. And so the important part of this is what are the partnerships to deliver this data, to maintain a scientifically credible product and keep it updated, because as you well know, the minute you do the map, it's obsolete. So we need to continue to move it ahead. So we're looking at the partnerships at the policy level, which we need to develop that network. As we've moved ahead with this, individual states have been developing their own chats, which see more as the mid to project-specific range, and to put some of those up here for you to look at and see the context of what is right now out there and running. So we have Montana, Washington, the Southern Great Plains, specific to the lesser prairie chicken, the Wyoming Interagency Wisdom Tool, California, and Arizona. Those are some I urge you to look at in terms of, you know, what are these decision support tools? How are they helping with project-specific and decision-making kinds of context of things? And then lastly, just this is a very large effort. I want you to appreciate, one is the data and information, the technical side of things, but the other, and I think we've heard this through the whole side of things, is the social construct and problem-solving piece that stands behind this and moves it ahead. The collaborative nature of this, the funding necessary to make this move ahead, and how, in many cases, I think some of the really cool stuff that I had never envisioned was the opportunity to develop shareware. For instance, Montana says, we'll do this, and it hexifies all the data layers, and they build the app, and then all states can use it. Another state says, we'll do this, and so you just get these economies of scales, and you have opportunities to achieve things that individually you would have never anticipated and never expected. And I think this is tremendously exciting. We realize we're building version 1.0. We're seeking to move this ahead. The Wildlife Council is taking this very seriously and moving it ahead to try to help with energy, as well as what's the greater picture of wildlife and how can we make that move forward. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Only for animals.
And while, like, you're not concerned about plant distributions or anything else like that.
Well, that's where we have not taken, again, states individually may put a plant species in there as one of their species. If they have a species of greatest conservation needs, it's a plant, they may elect to include that as part of their fine filter. And then on the coarse filter context of things, we are looking at it from an integrity context and large intact blocks. So in those, that's sort of the umbrella approach, which we hope are capturing some of those, you know, ecosystems and some of those plant associations under that larger context.
Yeah, I was looking at the lovely ribbon that is now the Ruby Pipeline for Guy's World. Mm-hmm. And that sort of change is coming about. Where's the concern on this?
Right, and that's where I think what we hope is that kind of thing is a developer is going to look at this map to start with. And then if they want to go into crucial area habitat 1, then they know it, they do it in full realization and a risk assessment, and then likewise, they also can say, you know, here's the best path to avoid all that important wildlife stuff. Here's our opportunities to really make things happen if it's a timing question.
Gregg, with the technology suite that this collaborative is going to deliver, is it an open systems technology? Is it, you know, on the premise of ESRI as our info platform? Can you share a little insight there on?
Yes, we're building this with ESRI software. Everything, obviously, geospatially, that's how, what we're taking it on. We're building it together, so we're sort of developing this shareware in terms of application and everything. The council is going to submit an RFP for building of the viewer, which is the application itself to allow this. So past that, I guess we're you know, going to see how it develops, and then how, to the extent that this collaboration continues forward, and what the cyber infrastructure is necessary to make that happen. And I think that'll be, in the same context, instrumental as to what is that partnership we talked about for data delivery and updates, and what does that mean in terms of data availability and protection, which are big questions to those of us who keep and maintain data. We realize the integrity of that is very important, as well as how much of it do we want to disclose and how much of it must remain hidden.
Gregg, this is the basis of this is really that energy corridor, transmission corridor, you know, the power lines and the distribution of energy. I'm not quite sure I can see the utility of that tool for a country, or for a company, for example, working in Utah in a specific area, because the state agency is going to have far better data. So what I see here is this is really designed from a grid standpoint to look at moving energy across the country. Isn't that correct?
It is correct. But also, as you said, the state's going to have far better data. This is the state's data. This entire picture is based on every state's data and information.
It's a corridor data. It's not the data from anything outside of those corridors.
Right, and that's where maybe, and this is where, so language is really important. So I want to shift that. I would say not better data, but more specific. So I think of this in terms of a hierarchy of decision making, and what I hear you suggesting is, at one level, there's these big picture, you know, how far does this 900-mile transmission line go, and where does it go? This helps answer that. But when it gets down to more specific questions and information, yes, that's where the states, and like Bill suggested, they're going to have to go to those experts and understand at a linkage or migration area. That's the kind of information that the states and folks like on the ground and in those offices are going to need to be queried and know about. But that's why I also put up those other state-based tools, because those are things that are being developed in parallel, which I think go further to reaching the ground and delivering some of those project level kind of answers.
Last question.
Does the plan address implementation at all, and then monitoring once you've implemented?
Yes, so it is not a project implementation tool. And we've always talked about this, and one of the things we've gone around, and when you sit around with 17 states who deal with this all the time in their own fiefdoms, you have this discussion. The tendency is to go right to a project level every time and say, we can't do this, because all of us as individual states, that's mostly where we deal with things, as we just heard. That's where the rubber meets the road, so we always talk about that. We had to consistently back up and say, this is a steering tool that helps answer the question at the first level from the developer's context, before he started making investments, before that company has started laying out money for all that kind of thing. That helps when you start putting dots on the map, where should we go and why, helps them answer, and does it at a risk context. So this is that high level, first level of decision making. So it doesn't get to any of that, but each of those tools, if you go check them out, they're all different, but some of them bring in best management practice suggestion, management guidelines. You know, you can't move ahead without talking to this, or here you've submitted your project, here's the polygon of your project, here is your printed out report, and it gives that as a start of that kind of consultation in terms of a project specific. And what we see the opportunity is if we continue this work, the tiering of the high level all the way down to the project level, then we're really starting to, you know, make the ground connect to this larger strategic picture, which I think we've all envied if we could ever make that happen. And ultimately, if we can build this to continue to keep it updated, that would just be exactly what we've been looking for. And make this sort of boundaryless in terms of this picture in a strategic context. I got to thinking, it brought up the other day, is we start to remove those externalities, which were basically, before it was like, we're going to do a project here, and the impacts are all about here, and you remove every discussion outside about the impacts to, let's say, sage grouse. You're just talking about the impact here, not sage grouse in general. But then we can talk about conservation of a species or a system or anything, maybe from a much bigger picture. And this actually brings those management agencies and together in a more coherent management approach.